Hello and welcome back to Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. Here we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to unpack why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're extremely excited to welcome three brilliant guests, Professor Alessio Patalano, Veerle Nouwens and Nick Childs, to discuss Japan's maritime security policy in the Indo-Pacific region. By way of introduction, Professor Alessio Patalano is Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, where he specialises in maritime strategy and doctrine, Japanese military history and strategy, East Asian security and British defence policy towards the Indo-Pacific. He is also the director of the King's Japan Programme and the newly established Indo-Pacific Programme at the Centre for Grand Strategy. Alessio's latest publication is The New Age of Naval Power in the Indo-Pacific, co-authored with Catherine Grant and James Russell. Welcome, Alessio.
Delighted to be on the platform. Thank you very much, Robert, for having me.
Excellent. Our second guest is Veerle Nouwens. Veerle is Executive Director, IISS-Asia, based in Singapore. Veerle's expertise lies in Chinese foreign and defence policy, as well as the wider Indo-Pacific defence and security environment. She plays a key part in organising the annual IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. She provides intellectual direction for IISS research on the Asia-Pacific and works to enhance further the profile of the IISS across the region and beyond. Welcome, Veerle.
Thank you for having me, Robert.
And finally, Nick Childs, who is IISS Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security. Nick is responsible for the Institute's analysis of naval forces and maritime security and for the data on sea power capabilities published in the IISS's flagship publication, The Military Balance. Nick also formulates and delivers research projects in these areas and contributes to other IISS publications and activities. Nick's latest piece is on AUKUS, and it's called The AUKUS, Anvil, Promise and Peril, which was published late last year in our Survival Journal. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Robert, and it's great to be with you all.
Let's start our discussion with the Japanese government's position on maritime security strategy. In April 2023, the Japanese government adopted its fourth master plan on ocean policy, which is the latest version of its 5-yearly review in this area. In the new maritime policy, Tokyo positioned the build-up of its comprehensive maritime strategy as one of the main pillars, which includes the defence, security and economic security fields. This new policy aligns with Japan's other policies related to maritime security, such as the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision and the revised 2022 National Security Strategy. Starting with you, Alessio, if I may, you mentioned in your recent piece in Time magazine that the world is currently, and I quote, in a contested maritime century, and we should start thinking about navies as the ultimate national security insurance policy. Among the different security elements in Japan's recent policy reviews, how does Tokyo position maritime security relative to other domains such as land and cyber?
Robert, thank you. I think it's an excellent place to start our conversation about maritime security, because when it comes to Japan, I think Japan is in many respects the ultimate example of how our understanding of maritime order has evolved, certainly in the last 20 years, if not in light of the coming into reality of UNCLOS. Because previously, before the third conference process that led to the establishment of UNCLOS as a set of basic principles for the use of the sea, maritime order was very much about, it's a hierarchical structure, it's about projecting power at sea and from the sea. It was about navies, first and foremost, and for those who could not afford navies, maritime forces in a sort of a lighter capacity. Early in the 1990s, Eric Grove, the late Eric Grove, had sort of come to organize that around this sort of hierarchical structure. And there was very much a manifestation of an earlier understanding of the sea as a place, a space from where states project power. Coming with UNCLOS in the process of awareness about the ocean as a living entity, you have another understanding of maritime order that sort of start being developed and sitting next to that. And that understanding is very much about the sea as a space that is functional for human life. We don't live at sea, but without the ocean, we can't continue to exist. That is important because it creates this awareness of rights and duties of coastal states and the international community to protect the environment in a sustainable fashion, try to engage with it in order to access its resources and harness their power or harvest their character, whether it is fish stocks or seabed related oil and gas resources. Japan, in this sense, is a very good example of that journey of transformation of an understanding of the sea as both as a place where the hierarchy of power in international relations is defined and transformed, but also as a place that is essential to human life and needs to be protected, preserved in order to be sustainably exploited. And so the basic Act on Ocean Policy that was enacted in 2007 reflects Japan's first structured reflection from a government perspective of all the stakeholders in the private and public space that engage with the sea, both in terms of regulating its access, defining its sustainable uses, as well as the vulnerabilities unfolding from states and private and public stakeholders engaging more in this space. What you have that you mentioned there is the fourth iteration of the 5-year implementation, if you want, guidelines unfolding from this 2007 law. And you are absolutely right in mentioning next to the national security strategy, because the 2024 version of this plan, like its previous version in 2018, was carefully constructed in light of the existing national security strategy. So if you want, in the hierarchy of documents around the national security in Japan, you have the national security strategy with the first one enacted in 2013. And then you have a number of documents related to this. And within that context, therefore, the national security strategy provided the umbrella in which both the contestation of power dynamics as well as the governance issues are defined in broader terms. And then you have these plans that are enacted, the fourth of which on ocean policy is the one that we've been discussing, that articulate with greater granularity what does the overall and overarching guidance means. And what's interesting is that a lot of the points that you raised in your opening remarks about the 2024 version were already present in the 2018 third plan. Particularly when it comes to maritime domain awareness, the preservation of remote islands, ocean survey, and then the research and development in the science related to it. What you have in the 2024 version is an emphasis of how the transnational issues of governance are becoming increasingly more intertwined with and inseparable from the wider geopolitical and geoeconomic conversation about power structure, and in particular shifting power structure. So what you have there is that comprehensive element in which maritime security, which should be about global challenges, sustainable development of the oceans, undersea critical infrastructure, and how they deliver connectivity and digital prosperity, economic development, being wrapped around these growing tensions, first and foremost for China, but then in a broader sense internationally.
Thank you, Alessio. Your point at the beginning about Japan as ultimate example of how the maritime order has evolved, that's piqued my interest, and perhaps if we have time, we can discuss that a bit more. Japan's security changes in maritime, particularly the maritime space, are not happening in a vacuum. Going back to the fourth master plan on ocean policy, it states that Chinese intrusions around the Senkaku Islands, called the Diaoyu in Chinese, explanation for the listeners, Japan controls these islands, China claims them. The fourth master plan describes these as one of the biggest maritime threats that Japan faces. The frequency and scope of Chinese grey zone activities reached, I think, the highest they've ever reached in 2023, which of course creates difficulties for constant surveillance in the East China Sea for Japan. In order to boost Japan's surveillance capabilities, Japanese Maritime Defense Force and the Japanese Coast Guard conducted their first joint live action exercise in June 2023. Veerle, how does China view these recent developments, considering that deploying the Japanese Maritime Defense Forces in the region could be seen as sort of escalatory by Beijing?
And I think it's a really interesting question, Robert. I haven't seen specific comments on this particular instance, but I would question to kind of what extent this really makes a difference in Beijing's mind. You can find criticism in Chinese language press on the Japanese self-defense forces' use of civilian infrastructure and assets in its annual exercises, notably, for example, last year, which quote unquote is seen as promoting the militarization of civilian facilities and creating a support system that integrates peacetime and wartime, hiding so called the military among the people. But you can likewise also find equal criticism of, for example, US Japan maritime law enforcement cooperation in the South China Sea again last year, which I've seen described in one case as the use of paramilitary forces. And so the underlying suspicion at the end of the day by China of the United States and of Japan is really quite entrenched. I therefore question the extent to which using one over the other, or whether using a combination of the two would necessarily be seen as a serious escalation. I think it would probably alternatively be seen as confirmation of intent, underlying suspicions that Beijing has held, as opposed to escalation. It's got to be mentioned that on the part of Japan and the United States, this would be seen as slightly ironic given China's own use of dual capable assets and hybrid civ-mil assets like civilian fishing fleets, otherwise dubbed the maritime militia. And we've got to note, of course, that China's own Coast Guard, meanwhile, is no longer under civil administration. So in 2018, the Chinese Coast Guard was placed under command of the Central Military Commission, and it has previously been, conversely, been under the civil control of the State Council and the State Oceanic Administration in China. So again, I kind of question to what extent this was really seen as an inflection point.
Interesting. In Japan, the working of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and the Japanese Coast Guard, for Japan, that's quite big news. So what you're saying is that for China, the view is already decided about what the intent that the US and Japan have in the region. So all this sort of changes within Japan are sort of less important for Beijing. Talking about the Senkaku Islands, quite near the Senkaku Islands lie Taiwan. The concerns about a Taiwan contingency, so an attack on Taiwan by China, is clearly a big maritime national security threat for Tokyo. With Taiwan's newly elected president Lai set to start his presidency in May this year, Japan's carefully monitoring the possibility of increased coercion by China, and as we've been discussing, Japan's been enhancing its naval capabilities. One example of this is the modification by Japan of two existing helicopter destroyers, Izumo and Kaga, which we're going to bring you in here, Nick. In the discussion before this podcast, we agreed to call them light aircraft carriers. So perhaps in your answer, you can refer to your thinking about these two vessels. But Japan's also increasing its amphibious capabilities to protect its own islands near Taiwan. So Nick, considering that this is the first time since World War II for Japan to possess aircraft carriers capability, what is the strategic significance of these capability upgrades for Tokyo in the naval sphere?
Thanks, Robert, and thanks to both Alessio and Veerle for their comments up to now. And perhaps to bring these strands together, as Alessio said, the transformation that we've seen, the evolution we've seen in the approach to the maritime space from the previous kind of hierarchical of naval affairs was the serious business, maritime security was somehow secondary. Now there is this sense both that the maritime is so interconnected and such a continuum now. Our concept of what is security now is very different, and that sees expression in the naval and maritime space, and it sees expression in what Veerle was talking about. You were asking about the increasing interconnectedness of the different naval and maritime agencies in different countries. Japan is responding to that continuum with closer integration of its naval forces and Coast Guard forces, but trying to keep the Coast Guard distinct. The Chinese are operating in a different way. The Americans are integrating in a different way, but it is to try and get to grips with the complexities that we now see in the naval space. In terms of the serious naval capabilities, to go specifically to your question, absolutely, the evolution and modifications that are underway with the Izumo and the Kaga in particular, multi-role destroyers as they're still described officially in Japanese terms, but are in effect light aircraft carriers, or they will be when they accept F-35B short takeoff aircraft on board. They are significant, but it is, if you like, an incremental evolution of Japan's naval perspective, but also, to some extent, its raising of its gaze and raising its naval ambitions as well. The move was originally mooted in terms of being able to operate fixed-wing aircraft from these ships as a defence of the outer islands. They're not full-size aircraft carriers, but they potentially, as they come into operation with aircraft on board, will be able to have a more power projection role in a limited way. The interesting question will be how this evolves over time as the doctrine evolves, as operating practice evolves. It will also depend on the dynamics of the region as well. These ships will give, ultimately, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force the ability, should they wish, to operate more independently and with greater self-protection capabilities at range in contested situations in a way that they didn't before, as part of a general upping and bolstering of Japanese maritime capabilities and maritime self-defense capabilities. Going back to hierarchies that Alessio was talking about before, and you were mentioning about Japan as a maritime nation. Japanese maritime defense capabilities, as they've evolved with the JMSDF, would be remarkable in isolation, were it not for the fact that in some ways they're overshadowed by what's happening in China and what's happening with the US and the capabilities that the US has. But Japan now has a very significant and capable and modernizing a fleet that, for example, overshadows any of the major European navies at the moment. There are discrete capabilities that it doesn't have, nuclear-powered submarines, for example. It doesn't have the experience to operate at range that, say, the French and the British has. But it also is developing some other very significant capabilities, including a ballistic missile defense capability at sea that's unmatched by any other nation at the moment other than the Americans.
Alessio, I can see you nodding vigorously there. You come in.
A couple of quick points. First of all, going back to something that Veerle was saying earlier, I think it's important that the point she was making that, if you're in Beijing, are you falling off your chair at seeing the first sort of larger exercise? Not really, because the key inflection point there was January 2016. And partly that is because in December 2015, for the first time, the Chinese deployed some of the Coast Guard crafters that have heavier weaponry on it, in particular some machine guns of a certain caliber, that outgunned anything in the arsenal of the Japanese Coast Guard, at least the assets deployed in the prefecture that is responsible for taking care of the Senkaku Islands. And in January 2016, the Ministry of Defense in Japan was very clear about the fact that anything that would create a capability gap between the Chinese and the Japanese around the islands would require the Japanese government to implement a maritime security operation in which the Coast Guard would lean on the military, in particular the JMSDF, to supplement and provide some sort of balance back. So when that announcement came out, of course, this was the first time that the Chinese government, and particularly the MFA spokesperson, very vigorously contested. But it became also clear in the aftermath of that particular point in time that the Chinese understood that there needs to be a certain sort of capability balance when it comes to that space. And from a Japanese perspective, the way the Chinese behaved would create a context for the packaging of the Japanese response. And you've seen that because since half 2016 and then beginning of 2017 onwards, you have a very different pattern of deployment to the Chinese Coast Guard and paramilitary organizations around the islands, which in a way gives you a sense that the Chinese now understand that the Japanese sort of structure has this concept of maritime security operation, which is the one that defines in many ways how the balance between the Coast Guard and the military will be set. And this leads to a point that Nick was making about we need to understand any transformation in Japan in relation to its context. If Japan exists in a vacuum, right, and given the constitutional setup, you would think, oh my goodness, Japan is making all these changes. That's quite remarkable. But if you set it against the context of the security landscape in Northeast Asia in particular, then Japan has been always very conscious of its constitution and taking steps in a way that is very much trying to find a fine balance between what is the minimum necessary to keep some sort of stability in the place and what would be beyond the constitutional letter. And this leads to a specific element of my second point, going to Nick's very elegant articulation of the Izuma question. We all know that in Japanese, any surface combatant is a goeikan, which literally is a self-defense ship. So the denomination that we have in English, like DDH for the Izuma, which is a helicopter carrying destroyer, it's a NATO-related thing that the Japanese adopt in a way that their surface combatants are intelligible to others. But the funny thing is that in Japanese, you don't have such a distinction. What you have, however, since 2004 White Defense paper is a clear definition that from the perspective of what is constitutionally allowed in terms of distinction between offensive and defensive capabilities, broadly defined, is that nuclear-powered carriers of the size and firepower of a US sort of dimension, so that's sort of 70,000 tons and above, that's something clearly with offensive punch, so it's beyond. Anything short of that, and this goes to Nick's point about the light cruisers, helicopter or aviation carrying cruisers. And funnily enough, the Italians went through a very similar thing with the Garibaldi, which was originally designed to be a helicopter carrying cruiser, and then it became a light carrier. The Invincible class has a similar journey. The point being that 2004 Ministry of Defense White Defense paper in Japan provided a clear definition of where do they draw the line. And anything short of the sort of US style, or in the Chinese context, that would be what we know about Chinese aircraft carrier number 3 and number 4, right? That's where the Japanese draw the line. Anything underneath that threshold really is not only allowed, but it is context related, the point that Nick was making. And so what is interesting about Izumo is that transformation is taking place because the security landscape, both at home and overseas, has changed to a point that a DDH, as originally conceptually developed, is no longer sufficient. And that's the last thing that brings together, again, the threads that we've been exploring on the governance stability dimension. The Japanese, if you take a step back and you put the Japanese experience in a broader sort of global context, they seem to have a home and away game when it comes to maritime security. At home, maritime security operations and the legal frameworks see the Japanese Coast Guard in the driving seat, and the self-defense forces, and in particular the maritime self-defense forces, as a supporting act to that. That's what we learn from the exercise. That's what we know from the manuals that they have. Away, outside the Japanese territorial waters, and certainly EEZ, and we know this from the practice of Japan's long-standing commitment to the counter-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden, the Navy is the sort of leading element of Japanese maritime security endeavor, with the Japanese Coast Guard being on the naval assets to provide the constabulary and legal elements to it. So in practical terms, for those who are listening, how does that work? So for example, you need to inspect a suspicious vessel. In Japanese home waters, it would be the Coast Guard job. And in case you have a suspicious North Korean vessel like in 1999 and 2001, the Navy would be like a shadow at your back to provide the extra security blanket. But in the Gulf of Aden, it would be a rib. The suspicious boat would be stopped by the naval vessel. On the ship, they would load down the rib to board the suspicious vessel with Coast Guard men on board, but boarding party from the Navy. The boarding party would secure the vessel, and then the Coast Guard would go on board. That draws a little tiny sort of legal granularity that translate into significant operational differences that go back to this idea of a home and away game.
Thank you, Alessio. I want to wheel China back into the room, given the impact that what's going on in China has on Japanese policy. One area that's getting more attention now is the underwater domain. One potential impact of Taiwan contingency would be the disturbance of communications infrastructure, such as underwater submarine cables, for example, which would then disrupt communications between the US and the Japan military or enable Chinese disinformation towards Japan's direction. Veerle, what threats do Taiwan, given that you know Taiwan so well, and potentially Japan, face in the underwater domain from China?
It's a very kind of live topical question that, is not just felt, of course, in the Northeast Asian context, but really in the European theater and more globally as well. So it's an excellent question. I mean, look, I think when it comes to the challenges and the threats that Taiwan and Japan likewise face, like others, is of course sabotage to underwater infrastructure, be that submarine cables for digital connectivity or be that energy pipelines, but of course also espionage and tapping into those. That's another part of the security challenge that is real. The additional factor to that that's extremely difficult is, of course, the degree of difficulty in really attributing the actors to the event, and then, of course, also attributing intent. So if we look at, say, one study, around 70% of undersea cable faults are caused by fishing vessels or ship anchors or natural causes or even shark bites. So there's, a wide variety of challenges there. I mean, if we look at Taiwan, for example, Taiwan's digital connectivity almost entirely is dependent on subsea cables. Taiwan depends on 15 submarine cables to connect it to the world, which makes it incredibly vulnerable. And it felt this acutely last year with an incident where 2 cables were cut by ships. Again, of course, denied responsibility and in the intent that Taiwan was suspicious of, but nonetheless caused problems for Taiwan in that respect. This vulnerability is likewise, of course, felt acutely by Japan. I think in the case of Taiwan, it's interesting, though, when you look at, say, responses. So Taiwan, in terms of how it's looking to mitigate these challenges, is seeking alternative forms of resilience. President Tsai's initiative to pledge $1.3 billion for Taiwan's indigenous space program, which will seek to kind of build an alternative to Elon Musk's Starlink satellite service, is a really interesting example there. Taiwan seeks to send its first communications satellite into orbit by 2026 and a second one by 2028, or at least in 2028, which is quite ambitious. It shows, I think, the urgency to which Taiwan is seeking to respond. I think in the case of Japan as well and other allies, there's really interesting initiatives in the form of the Quad's Partnership for Cable Connectivity and Resilience. But further afield, NATO's own response by setting up a Maritime Center for Security of Critical Underwater Infrastructure is a really excellent example of, again, the wide variety of challenges to underwater infrastructure that countries increasingly will need to be met. So not just a Taiwan-Japan problem, but one that everyone truly faces.
Thanks, Veerle. We'll come to the Quad in a second. Nick, I just want to pick up on this underwater domain point. Given that China and North Korea and Russia, all of which are cooperating in various ways now, are increasing their subsurface warfare capability in East Asia, what does Japan need to do to strengthen its own subsurface capabilities?
As Veerle said, there's this awakening around issues around undersea vulnerabilities. It's not new as an issue, but it's the dependencies that are making a difference now, but also the technologies that are being invested in order to create a potential threat. And one of the big deficits, as Veerle underlined, for everybody in terms of protection is in the grey zone arena when so much could be accidental, natural causes, the plausible deniability and the deficits in being able to tribute quickly and at a pace of relevance in this fast-moving world has been shown up as a deficit for everybody. The extent to which it becomes a naval challenge is debatable. Yes, the naval forces have a point, but this is going to be something that is across agencies. It's going to be across governments. We talk about critical national infrastructure in many cases, particularly in the maritime environment. It's critical international and interconnected infrastructure. So things like the Quad initiative that Veerle mentioned is important. In the Japanese context, actually, in some ways, Japan is in a better space than some. It has invested in some very highly capable, undersea capabilities of its own. It's submarines, not nuclear powered, but they're almost of a capability of nuclear powered submarines without the nuclear reactor in a way. They're very advanced capability, and it's one of the very few nations to operate, for example, these TAGOS ships, ocean surveillance ships that trail very low frequency sonars that can monitor the undersea environment. So in some ways it's in a better space, but I think there is a deficit that everyone is grappling with of whose responsibilities this protection is. How do you go about it? Is it about building in more resilience? And maybe for Japan and the countries in East Asia, the multiplicity of cables becomes, resilience dividend in a way, because you can chop and change around. But it's developing more probably in connection with commercial space. And again, here, Japan is probably better place than many. Those kinds of remote undersea capabilities that the commercial sector has that can be leveraged to monitor and, if necessary, repair, as well as attribute if there are any nefarious activities that are being undertaken in the cause of creating tensions and raising questions.
Veerle, if I can quickly come back to you on the Quad, what do you think the challenges are for the Quad in evolving as a security framework to counter Chinese assertiveness in the region?
The Quad, of course, came from, some would call it lower level hanging fruits with regards to, say, global goods like providing humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, evolving into economic security. And so I think the kind of hard security defense aspect of that has been the most difficult part for the Quad to develop into. We've seen new initiatives, particularly on maritime security, and I think it's clear that maritime security has become a solid focus for the grouping. For instance, of course, the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, but separate to that, informally, and this is, I think, where you have seen movement, at least informally amongst the four partners, separate and in different formations, minilateral activities, be they joint exercises or otherwise, where you have seen that progress. So I think on the one hand, I think it is still very much up to the individual partners of the Quad to find comfort levels amongst the four, but not necessarily with all four, to provide maritime security, be that in terms of anti-submarine warfare exercises or maritime logistics. At least in terms of the IPMDA, I think maritime domain awareness is probably the strongest opportunity for the grouping to at least move forward. Maritime capacity building could be another one, but I still think that, in terms of the real hard defense angle, this is probably going to remain the weakest aspect of the grouping.
Alessio, Veerle mentioned minilaterals. The region is now being sort of crisscrossed by bilateral ties, minilateral frameworks, and of course there's multilateral organizational interests in the region as well. So how does Japan navigate strategically between all of these growing networks to pursue its own geopolitical interests?
What is interesting is, so Japan has one ally, and that's the United States. And by that, I mean, when you set the threshold around the presence or absence of any type of agreement in which one side is compelled to act and come to the defense of the other in case of an attack. So when you have that sort of clause built into your framework, and it must be said that NATO's Article 5 is the highest level of benchmarking. Then you've got US-Japan Article 5 style, which is not exactly the same. It's slightly less committing in terms of it compels the United States to consider what to do, but it doesn't say exactly what exactly to do. Short of that, and that is a very high benchmark. So I don't think that we can these days talk a lot about quasi-allies, informal allies. I think there's a risk in diluting a fundamental difference. And this goes back to a point that was implicit in what Veerle was saying, but is absolutely essential. And that is, Quad is a nice club where one coordinates and cooperates, but then you are only as strong as your individual contribution to it and comfort zone in it, right? Being an ally is a completely different ballgame altogether. And it requires states to set themselves and their internal and domestic system in a way that are able to support that commitment. That means security practices. That means, all of the changes that we've seen looking at, and even the upcoming meeting with Kishida visiting DC and the talks about upgrading yet again the US-Japan bilateral agreements. It's because that framework of being an ally has requirements which in today's world and reality are raising the challenge for countries like Japan in particular to meet those very high standards of requirement in information security management, in operational configuration, in the capacity of the government to mobilize military power as a tool of statecraft in times of crisis and war. Japan has one alliance with the United States that sets a particular context and benchmark. And then underneath it, that's where it becomes really interesting, because that's where you realize Japanese agency and the ability to play with minilateralism, both quadrilateral context as well as the trilateral, on top of the bilateral relationships. And what's interesting there is that the vocabulary deployed. So, for example, if you think about UK-Japan have a global strategic partnership, which is different from the one that Japan has with Australia, which is a special strategic partnership, which is different from, for example, the one that Japan has with France, which is an exceptional partnership, which is all strategic because France and Japan are Indo-Pacific nations. This is not vocabulary that is thrown out there by accident. It defines the parameters and the foundations around which these bilateral links are built. And through these bilateral links, then you have the minilateral at the sort of trilateral level, and then you go up. And I think that's where Japan is navigating, if you want, the complexities of a region in which the regional security architecture does not have, in the security terms, the sort of NATO-styled multilateral frameworks, and therefore it's a combination of acting bilaterally, trilaterally, and then quadrilaterally and upwards, with the distinction being driven by, of course, you can do the most with the smallest number of actors, and then the ambition sort of gets diluted or contextualized as you widen out the number of partners involved. And I would say Japan's used the bilaterals to define how to set the agenda at the highest possible level, short of the alliance context with the United States in terms of advancing on different issues. So the global element in the UK-Japan relationship is that Japan and the UK work a lot in terms of broad and multilateral setting agendas on big domains, whether it is cyber, space, maritime. Strategic, when it comes to Australia, it's because with Australia there is a direct correlation of what you do together in that particular neck of the wood, which is sort of East Asia, east of Singapore. That's, to me, where you have the building blocks, those bilateral. And then you have the trilateral, which is one step up. And from my perspective, Japan is using the trilateral space to advance either operational understanding on how to operate with others within its region, look at what it's doing with Australia and the United States, for example, or to develop advanced capabilities with like-minded countries and trusted partners. So look at, for example, GCAP with the UK. And then from there, you widen out in the sort of broader, more cooperative and coordinating ambitional element, rather than that greater, deeper, substantive, looking at the hardcore pillars of international security, as it were.
Nick, you've got your hand up. You want to say something?
Yeah, it was just to build on Alessio's point. As he indicated, the core for Japan is the US relationship. And if you like, looking at the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, in terms of potential high-end conflict of whatever description, the JMSDF's construct makes sense, mainly in the context of a complement to US naval capabilities and as an adjunct to that in many ways. But we're in a world, as the US is finding, where nobody is able to do everything all on its own. And that's actually giving, in some ways, more agency, but also more dilemmas to some extent, but also more opportunities for countries like Japan, sort of medium-sized powers with like-minded security strategic analyses coming together. That's why you're seeing this web developing. But in the context, particularly of the Asia-Pacific region, the challenge for Japan as a country that hasn't had to grapple with this and hasn't had to grapple with some of the protocols and issues around, on the one hand, being able to share information has a greater premium, but being able to protect it as well has a greater premium. And I think there's a steep learning curve as well. But managing these relationships, these defense technology relationships like AUKUS, like GCAP, will be a key for governments, particularly a government like Japan, going forward, and also delivering them in the long term with a multitude of partners.
Just to focus down a bit on the sort of navigation theme in this section of the podcast, Japan's ally, the US, and others have been conducting freedom of navigation operations around contested sea lanes, such as the Taiwan Strait and the area near the Spratlys and the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. Nick, considering growing Chinese naval power in East and South China Sea, how effective have these operations been, do you think?
I think they have been important and significant as, if you like, statements of intent, following up and delivery, and activity to underscore supposed issues around principles like freedom of navigation. They're important, but they're not sufficient, I think, is my question mark over this. And actually, freedom of navigation operations are not in and of themselves a strategy. I'm not sure they are actually changing behavior as far as China is concerned. They're keeping a marker in place, but they're not a strategy for changing behavior. In some ways, the coming together, and this is broader than freedom of navigation operations, the coming together of formations of navies in interoperable task groups to exercise together is perhaps a more significant development in terms of potentially sending signals of deterrence going forward. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing more high capability, interoperable task group operations with, call them aircraft carriers, call them flat tops, whatever you like, the flat tops from the United States, Australia, and Japan, operating together. That does, I think, send more of a signal and may change the pendulum of deterrence somewhat if they are continue to be seen to be effective.
And Veerle, again on China, how's China been reacting to the operations of the US and others in this space?
First, I would just like to really agree and echo what Nick has said. I mean, these are not sufficient in and of themselves, but I think it's also really incumbent on extra-regional countries or regional countries who are doing these operations to also explain what the purpose of them is. So, the purpose of them is not to just do them or to necessarily deter China. That would not necessarily be possible. But of course, it is to send a signal, as Nick said, in a variety of ways. And I think this does come through to Beijing. I think China, if we talk about European deployments to the region, whether they're freedom of navigation operations and exercises or not, those are often met with flippant remarks in Chinese press or ridicule. But it's interesting, of course, that it feels the need to do that. And I think it really strikes at the heart of one insecurity that Beijing holds, which is that China does not have alliances. It does not have these very deep-rooted partnerships to the extent that Europe, the US, Australia, and others have. It doesn't really have partners to really deploy or exercise in this kind of joint integrated way. And so that is an important signal in and of itself. It's also, of course, important to signal to China that this is not just an issue that was one between the United States and Beijing. It's one that is of international concern. And it's a signal that is likewise sent to countries in the region of one of support. And then finally, one that underscores the importance of international law and UNCLOS in particular, and rejects the interpretation that China has of some of these principles within UNCLOS. So I think it is really important. I think it does strike to a deep insecurity on Beijing's part.
Thank you, Veerle. And move to our last question on the sea and Japan in this podcast. And we're about 8 months, I think, by my calculations, away from the US presidential election. In Japan, the word of the moment is Moshi Tora. What would happen if Trump won? This is doing the rounds, and Japanese government and ministries and so on doing lots of thinking about what they might have to do if Trump did indeed win election in November. What do you think would be the impact of a second Trump presidency on the US's Indo-Pacific maritime strategy? And within that, what should Japan do to navigate this particular issue?
That's an excellent question, and perhaps a complicated question to address. Before we get to that, a small point on the question of freedom of navigation, because it matters in terms of the Trump point. Freedom of navigation operations, as the Americans call them, it's an American thing. Nobody else has a freedom of navigation operations program. The US has it for historical reasons that go back to the third conference process, which were then institutionalized when they failed to ratify UNCLOS. But at heart, they are about preventing the erosion of practice over the use of the seas. And then over time, they focused on how you treat behavior on the high seas and then how you apply UNCLOS. And that's very much how the Americans look at it. If you think of France, the UK, any other country that's including Japan, we have to draw a distinction between the advertise, oh, I'm doing this today, from I'm sailing through in accordance to UNCLOS to prevent the erosion of practice. That everybody does it. The fact that it's not advertised, we only know the ones that the United States advertise as part of their program, but we don't even know the extent to which of how many they conduct. And that's not just in terms of Chinese claims. Anybody's successive claims. The UK does it, France does it, Japan does it, as we've learned through media coverage. So in that sense, I think we need to be careful when we boil it down to FONOPS, as it were, because there's a fundamental distinction between the US program and the fact that everybody else sails. And it sails in a way that is consistent with the application on UNCLOS. And that matters because it builds to the point that both Nick and Veerle were alluding to in terms of when you advertise or it is reported, is because you are adding a particular political signal on top of the fact that you are navigating to ensure that the existing practice of application of principles of navigation at sea are protected. Now, this leads insofar as the maritime is concerned to the question about what happens with Trump. From our perspective, there's three things that in the Japanese government at the moment, they're probably everybody's very consumed by. Number one, making sure that no matter what happens on day one, that if there's a Trump Mark II presidency, the president will speak to Prime Minister Kishida, or whoever is going to be the Prime Minister in Japan at that point in time. And then Japan is mentioned at the very top of the list of the phone calls to the president. So that's an absolutely all-concerning thing. And in the first speech of the Union that the president does, Japan is mentioned a number of times. That's the sort of things that with someone as mercurial as Trump, if you're in the Japanese government, you want to make sure that Japan is front and center on the good side of every time Trump sort of decides to go out there and speak. So number one is ensure that the visibility of Japan is where it should be. And I'm pretty sure at the moment there will be lots of very busy people in New York and DC trying to reach out to whoever is going to be around Trump, which in itself is a bit of a challenge to identify. The number 2 point is about who is going to be in the Trump administration and who is going to provide the intellectual, if you want, raw materials. In the Republican context, we've seen some very vocal voices like Bridge Colby. We know of less vocal voices around some of the key institutions. And then who knows who else will come in with Trump. That will have an impact in terms of how much there's a priority over the Indo-Pacific as opposed to other issues, and to what extent China will be dealt with in that context. All of this will matter to Japan because it will define the extent to which Japan will be either, as it was on Trump Mark I, a counterbalancing voice to the United States or a reinforcing voice depending on the type of action that the United States will decide to undertake. And the third thing that will be very important to the Japanese government is to understand the balance between the mercurial nature of Trump's statements and the actual institutional translation of those statements into particular practice. Say, for example, in Trump Mark I, one of the things that created an enormous amount of concern to the late Prime Minister Abe was Trump's idea to solve North Korean issue, whatever that meant in his mind. And then when the Japanese government understood that the meeting with Kim Jong-un was first and foremost about a photo op in a nice hotel, then everybody calmed down because they knew that institutionally they needed to work with the administration over to ensure that the minimum layer of concerns from Japan, so for example, short and medium range missiles, would fall within the broader concerns that Trump approach was bringing. So understanding how to draw the distinction and the balance between statements coming out of Trump and actual practice at the working level within the Trump administration, if there is one, and working with them to ensure that the core of Japanese interest in regards to major issues in Northeast Asia, North Korea being one, Russia and its implication being another one, and of course China as a bigger thing. And I would say within this context also, how the Trump administration will behave in regards to multilateralism in the region. These 4 set of issues will be absolutely central in the mind of Japanese officials when it comes to draw that balance between Trump's outspoken nature and mercurial character and the institution behind Trump, that is the Trump administration, in implementing policies in relation to these 4 major topics.
Nick, Moshitora for US naval strategy in the region and Japan's too.
In some ways, one could argue that actually you've seen continuity over the last 2 or 3 administrations as far as particularly the evolution of attitudes towards China, for example, just in terms of overall approach. But it does get to this question, let's not assume a second Trump presidency, but it does get to this question that Alessio pointed to of, if you like, the mechanics and the mercurial nature of the man and how he operates should there be a second administration. And one of the discontinuities is the approach to policy around that. And it's been much more systematic and systemic under the Biden administration. The concept of integrated deterrence and systematic attempts to bring together a coalition of allies and partners in a real sense. The work that's gone on, for example, with South Korea and Japan and the US, would that continue under a Trump administration? Question mark. That's the main issue. So you may see a greater demand and therefore a greater appreciation of allies and partners like Japan stepping up, burden sharing. That would make a difference, and that would be part of the shopping list as far as Trump is concerned. But there may be other questions around how that would also play out in terms of delivering capability into the region. Would America first be part of that? Would that mean that, for example, something like AUKUS would be under threat because the Trump administration and Mr. Trump would say we need more American submarines, not others? Or would that fall into the burden sharing of allies kind of basket? So I think those are where the uncertainties are.
Thank you, Nick. That brings us to our concluding questions, our 2 Japan Memo questions, which we ask all our guests. I'm very excited to hear what you're going to say, Alessio, Nick and Veerle, on this. First question is, do you have a book recommendation or books for listeners who wish to understand Japan? And you are allowed to recommend your own books. And the second question is, what do you think people often get wrong about Japan. So, Alessio, over to you.
So first of all, I won't recommend my books, although you should buy them and have them next to your bed and read them every night before you go to bed. So I won't recommend those. That would be too obvious. But two things that actually allow to recommend two books. One, we all know that at the moment there is a TV drama which I think is exceptionally well done and accurate about Tokugawa Japan and sort of the era of post-warring states, Japan and pre-Meiji. And in that sense, one of the best books that I would recommend is The Company and the Shogun. It's a beautiful book that talks about the Dutch East India Company. It's the background, intellectual and deeply well-researched background to understand the drama and the novel, the original novel Shogun, that was built upon it. And the other book that I would recommend, which relates to the broader context of what we've talked about today, because of course the maritime in Japan is important, but needs to be understood in the broader transformation of Japan, is Sheila Smith's Japan's Rearmed, which is a very good entry-level text. It's the sort of text that, again, everybody should sort of acquaint themselves with to be able to get the basic right about the historical links to where Japan is today. Because very often the problem with those who look at Japan is that they come from a US-Japan, if you want, security ties background. And so the depth of Japanese background and history to understand where it is today as a security actor is very much misunderstood. So these two books, I think, would be very good background context for understanding Japan and the maritime role in its history and contemporary relevance is concerned.
And what do people get wrong about Japan?
Japan has got deep reservoir of emotions. I mean, again, there's a lovely passage in one of the episodes of this television drama, which I think is perfectly right. When people go to Japan and they see everything is structured, organized, people bow, smiling, and everything seems to be traveling on a very tight track. But the truth of the matter is that there's a deep reservoir of emotions and feelings. And what people get wrong about Japan is that there are layers of wilderness in terms of emotions and feelings and complexity and texture to life, which in fact is very much betrayed, but a superficial sort of packaging that seems very orderly. So my invitation is always, Japan is like the opera. It's a sort of place that you go, the first time you go there, either it blows your mind away, or you will come to appreciate it, but it's not necessarily the thing for you. It's like the top 5 destination in your lifetime, and you keep saying like, I'm going to go there next time, and you never eventually go. But once you go there, it's like the opera. It takes you and it blows you away because it speaks deeply to your soul. Or maybe you find it very elegant, very interesting, but perhaps not your cup of tea, as it were.
There is a follow-up question to that, which I will save for when we see each other in person, Alessio. Like, what kind of opera are we talking about?
That's a very good question, actually.
Nick, recommended books and what do people get wrong about Japan?
My suggestion for a book, it's a bit of a curio and it's a very short book, but it goes to both elements of the discussion, Japan, but also the maritime. It's a book not by a Japanese national, but it's called Battleship Yamato by Jan Morris. She has alighted upon it because of the symbolic and iconic nature of Battleship Yamato, both in terms of as an engine of war, if you like, both in a sense the magnificence, but also the tragedy of it around that time of the middle of the last century. Its symbolic nature as, probably the most powerful battleship ever built, but also its symbolism of what it meant for as far as Japanese society, military culture, but also naval power at the time. It's subtitled Of War, Beauty and Irony. It's a short read, but I think a very elegant exposition of the symbology and emotions around this iconic battleship. In terms of what people get wrong, I'm afraid I think Alessio has kind of slightly stolen my thunder, because my response was going to be everyone has sort of national stereotypes about others around the world, but I think there's a particular issue as far as Japan is concerned. It's particularly strong as far as from the outside looking in. There is this sense of a very strong stereotypical Japanese with kind of rigid cultural perspectives and so on and so forth. And if that was ever right, it isn't now and probably hasn't been for decades. So I think that would be my reflection. Japan suffers particularly from the outside looking in stereotype problem.
Thank you, Nick. And over to you, Veerle.
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of a book recommendation, I had preferred rather two kind of cheeky alternative answers, which is one, first, in terms of an area of research or an area of interest, which is, really understanding some of the legislative angles of Japan that kind of are an obstacle to Japan's foreign policy cooperation. So, there has been a great degree of intrigue around whether Japan will or will not become an additional partner to AUKUS, particularly with regards to Pillar 2. But, understanding the issues around security clearance, around information protection, around counter-espionage laws. I think that is an absolutely fascinating angle, which perhaps is not necessarily well understood by all. It seems almost like an obvious partner for AUKUS, and why would there be any obstacle to that? So that's kind of one area that I thought should be on everyone's radar. And of course, we are seeing really interesting developments in Japan in that space, and some really interesting articles out there that are kind of back and forthing this. In terms of a publication worth reading, I mean, I'm going to be really cheeky here and say that here at the IISS-Asia, we published and led a paper on Indo-Pacific long-range strike capability developments in the Asia Pacific. And so that has been a really interesting examination of a range of countries, everything from North Korea, China, but also, of course, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, you name it, to look at strategic perceptions, existing capabilities, and also intent for future development when it came to precision strike and long-range strike as well, and the kind of opportunities and challenges within that space. And I think with regards to Japan as well, I think just understanding the underlying and the interlinked security threat perceptions that are really driving these dynamics in the region was a fascinating exploration in this paper. So highly recommend that you all look that up. I think with regards to what people get wrong about Japan, I think the angle that I'd much rather pursue is what I myself find really interesting about Japan, and what I myself was struck by, over the years as we saw this evolve, and the determination on the part of Japan to really assess and look ahead, have that strategic foresight with regards to very key strategic challenges and the interlinking of those globally, and that concept of the Indo-Pacific, for example, and the determination on the part of Japan to really create an understanding of why this is so important, and the follow-on that we've seen in the policy and defense space on that, I think, has been remarkable. So for me, that has been a fascinating evolution to watch.
Thank you, Veerle. Thank you very much, Alessio, Veerle, and Nick, for your insights on today's podcast. Much appreciated. A really rich discussion we had. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. For any comments or feedback, please contact us by email on japanchair@iiss.org. If you enjoyed this episode, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research by the Japan Chair Programme and by the IISS on our website. We also hope to connect with you on X, where we are actively sharing the latest news and analysis on everything Japanese geopolitics and more. You can find me on X at Robert Allen Ward. You can find Alessio at Alessio Naval, all one word. And you can find Veerle at Veerle Nouwens. And you can find Nick at Childs NJ. Thanks again, and see you next time. Goodbye.